From Ohio, Mr. Davidson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for your comments, sir. I appreciate your service and really a critical national security component for our country. Indeed, economic security is a vital component of national security, and we've been able to leverage that with the sanctions regime. And as you allude to, one of the keys to that effectiveness has been engaging allies to unite against adversaries. One of the things that I'm concerned about is our trade policy. Our trade policy is currently doing just the opposite. It's multiplying our enemies instead of multiplying our allies. And so I'm personally exploring how we could use the sanctions regime, which has achieved great results, to be much more targeted. In modern warfare, we do everything we can to minimize collateral damage and to focus everything on our adversaries. And the nice thing about the sanctions toolkit is you don't even have to levy them against an entire country. You can levy them against a company or, as you've alluded to already, with a couple Russian oligarchs, against individuals. So I'm curious, as you look at adapting the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives this authority, it's historically been used for other foreign policy objectives, but do you see any particular roadblocks to applying it in trade policy?
I think, Congressman, that is a very incisive question. I have to confess, trade policy is beyond my remit. I have a hard enough time just on the sanctions side of the House. But I'd actually like to explore this with you in greater detail to understand ways that we could work together on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so the logic would be that for similar purposes that we're currently engaging in unilateral action on tariffs, frankly, maximum collateral damage in the case of uniform tariffs, for example. Here we could be very precise and say target Chinese steel companies. Rather than taxing all the steel in the world, we could simply use the power of sanctions to target two specific companies, for example. I am curious, however, because the intent is very aggressive with our sanctions. Effectively, once sanctions go into effect on a company, we're not anticipating a future for that company. In fact, we're doing everything we can to disrupt their entire business model. I am concerned about the collateral damage that may happen as we impose sanctions. So help me understand what happens if an American company is actually partnered with a company or individual that becomes subject to sanctions. In my preparation or study for how I would apply this to trade policy, I've come across some companies, some of them wholly owned by Americans, but because they became involved with individuals or companies that were the targets of sanctions, they've found it impossible to even operate it, the business. And in general, when they can get a temporary relief with a license, it's really just to unwind the business. So for the policy I anticipate with application to trade, you would have to focus this in a way that could have, not necessarily a terminal effect, but a painful one. And how do you minimize the collateral damage for the American?
So, Congressman, that's a great question. One thing I would say at the outset is that our sanctions are designed fundamentally to induce a change in behavior. And so we want to be mindful of that.
Currently at the country level more so than at the company level, correct?
Company or individual. But I mean, again, I think there are some instances where we have targeted companies, potentially very big ones, that were owned by some pretty nefarious actors and then immediately issued some licenses to allow them to extricate themselves from their ownership situation. The other thing I would offer to look at, and we could explore this together further, is how we crafted the Venezuela executive order that prohibited U.S. persons from engaging in any new debt or equity with the Venezuelan regime. As you mentioned the issue of blowback, one of the things that we saw in the case of the PDVSA bonds that were issued, but as Maduro is stealing from his oil industry, is we wanted to ensure that the secondary bond market was protected from the effects of that action. And that might be a very instructive model that we used in that particular case for what you're driving at.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just in general, let's say that U.S. Steel had partnered with Severstal in the U.S. We wouldn't want the employees in that company that are based in the United States to not be able to get payroll, for example. And right now, those licenses are necessary. What's a general timeline to get that work through for a company that's partnered?
So that you're absolutely right. Our goal is not to harm any U.S. jobs or jobs in our friends or allies. I'd have to get back to you with OFAC on the specifics on those licenses.
All right, thank you. My time's expired. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes